Hello students, I'm your teacher Mark Botero. Today I'm going to be teaching you simple tips on how to work with modals. So grab your notebook, grab a pen, and take some notes on how you can use modals. An important thing that you need to keep in mind when using modals is that some modals are stronger than others. A good way to imagine this is to imagine a scale from 0 to 100. Some modals will be about 100%. Other modals would be less, all the way down the scale to 0%. Let's take a look at our first modals: should, shouldn't, and ought to. These modals are used to give advice, and let's look at it in a context of giving advice to different travelers. For this example, let's take our traveler, John. John is taking a trip to Canada in December. His mother, being a caring mother, has advice for John. Let's look at what she can say. She can say, for example, "John, you should pack extra gloves. John, you ought to bring another sweater." Or, "John, you should not bring swim shorts." Let's take a look at how each of these are being used. When we use should, we should not follow it by any preposition. When we use ought to, you can see that the preposition to follows the word ought. If you avoid using to, it is a big mistake, so please make sure you put the to after ought. The most common of both of these, should and ought to, is should. It is the one that is most regularly used, and it is the one most recommended. Let's take a look at how we can use the negative form of should. Here is our example. You shouldn't bring swim shorts. Notice that when we use the negative, not goes in front of should. What about our example using ought to? Is there a negative form for this? When we use ought to, there is no negative form. You can only use not with should. Now let's take a look at how we can make the question forms for should or ought to. If you want to make a question, for example, John could ask, "Should I pack more socks? Should I bring another sweater?" Notice that the modal should begins the question. Also notice that ought to is not being used in any of these examples. That is because ought to cannot be used in the question form. Before we continue with the next modals, let's do a couple practice examples with should and ought to. Here on my right, you see two images. In the first example, the person looks very sick. Take a second with your notebook and your pen and write down some suggestions that you would give this person. Examples that you can say to suggest for the first example is, "You should go to the doctor." "You ought to take more medication." "You shouldn't be around other people." In the second example, you see a traveler whose luggage is way too full. Take a few seconds and think of some suggestions that you could give this traveler. Pause the video and play when you want to see my suggestions. For example, you can tell this traveler, "You should pack less shirts." "You should buy a bigger suitcase." "You shouldn't bring that heavy bag on an airplane." The next modal we will look at is had better. Some things to keep in mind with had better is that had better is much stronger than should or ought to. When we use had better, it is also important to keep in mind that there is a connotation of a negative consequence if you don't follow the instructions given. Let's take a look at some examples using John the traveler. John's mother is going to give him some strong advice about his trip to Canada. Here are some examples. "You had better avoid talking to strangers." "You had better avoid taking extra weight in your bag." "You had better live in a good area." Let's take a look at what the negative connotation for each of these might mean. Here's our first example. "You had better avoid talking to strangers." The negative connotation behind this is that if John speaks to strangers, something bad might happen. Let's take a look at the second example. "You had better avoid taking extra weight in your bag." In this example, the negative connotation is that if John brings extra weight on his bag, he could be charged an extra fee. Now for our final example. You had better live in a good area. In this one, the negative connotation is that if John does not live in a good area, something bad can happen to him. Maybe he can get robbed or his car can get stolen. So notice that when we use had better, the connotation is that if you do not follow the advice, something negative will happen. Using our example of John the Traveler, let's take a look at had better in its negative form. You had better not talk to strangers. You had better not take extra weight in your bags. You had better not live in a bad area. Notice that when we use the negative form, had better is in the infinitive form. Also notice that had better cannot be used in question form. Now let's take a look at some practice examples. Here are two images. Think of what suggestions you would give for these two images using had better. Keep in mind that had better always carries a negative consequence. Pause the video now and write down a few suggestions. Let's take a look at the first example. In the first image, one possible suggestion can be, you had better arrive early to the airport. In the second image, one possible suggestion can be, you had better bring your passport. Let's take a look at the first example. You had better arrive early to the airport carries a negative consequence that if you don't arrive early to the airport, you might miss your flight. In the second example, you had better bring your passport, there is a negative consequence that if you do not bring your passport, you might not be able to catch your flight. When we talk about the modals must and have, has to, we are talking about something that requires 100% obligation. Let's take a look at some real examples for you to get accustomed to using these modals. In this image, you see someone wearing a face mask, perhaps in a situation of COVID or where it's mandatory to wear a face mask. One thing we can say is, you must wear a face mask. Remember that must is 100% obligation. Let's look at have and has to. If I'm going to the airport to travel to Canada with my mother, I can say, for example, she has to bring her passport to the airport. Or I can say, I have to bring my luggage to the airport. Once again, have and has to is 100% obligation. Now let's do a couple practice examples for you to put into use. In this image, we see a situation where someone is obligated to do something. Think of what recommendations you can use using must, have to, or has to make a strong recommendation for them. Keep in mind, have, has to, and must are used for 100% obligation. Compare your examples of obligations with the answers that I'm going to give you now. The doctor must wear a face mask. The doctor has to have gloves. The doctor must wear an apron during surgery. I hope this video is helping you understand how to use modals. Let's continue to the next section. In this example, you see someone going to the airport. Here are some ways we can use the negative form of must, have to, or has to. He mustn't arrive early to the airport. He doesn't have to arrive early to the airport. I don't have to arrive early to the airport. In these three examples, it is not obligation, it is now optional. Also keep in mind that when you use must, there is no to followed by must. And the verb that follows must is in the infinitive form. Also keep in mind that when you use have or has, it must be followed by the preposition to, and the verb that follows must be in the infinitive form. Alright guys, we're going to go ahead and finish here for now. You have a few modals with you that you can use whenever you need to express obligation, recommendation, or suggestion. Try using these in different circumstances, and anytime you're confused, come back to this video. I hope it was helpful. Remember, I'm your teacher, Mark Botero, and I'll see you next time.